Hello everyone, and welcome to our videocast on civil procedure and trial practice as it applies to healthcare management. Now let's talk about evidence. So evidence comprises the facts that are established or challenged during a lawsuit shaping the outcome of the case. The law of evidence is the framework of principles dictating how these facts may be proven, ensuring that only reliable and relevant information is presented to the judge or jury. Within this structure, rules of evidence govern which items or testimonies are admissible, helping maintain a fair and orderly proceeding and preventing the introduction of material that could confuse or prejudice the fact-finding process. Direct evidence is typically presented through first-hand testimony, such as an eyewitness account or direct statement from someone with personal knowledge of the facts in dispute. While expert testimony can play a key role in explaining specialized matters to a judge or jury, its admissibility depends on whether the expert is properly qualified. Merely being a pharmacist, for instance, does not automatically suffice if the issue demands expertise outside one's professional scope. If a party's conduct rises significantly above ordinary carelessness, it may constitute gross negligence, a more severe form of negligence potentially carrying heavier liability consequences. Now let's talk about demonstrative evidence and documentary evidence. So, demonstrative evidence is proof presented through physical or visual aids, such as photographs, imaging studies, or the direct observation of patient injuries, making it a highly credible and preferred form of evidence, because it shows rather than merely tells. Demonstrative evidence is often considered particularly trustworthy, as jurors can see the actual objects or images referenced by witness testimony. By contrast, documentary evidence relies on written or recorded information, including medical records, manufacturers' drug inserts, relevant statutes and regulations, institutional policies, procedures, and even social media posts or emails. These documents help establish a factual basis for the case, clarify timelines, and verify statements made by the parties involved. Hearsay evidence refers to statements, written or oral, based on second-hand information rather than the direct personal knowledge of the witness presenting them. Because the speaker of the original statement cannot be cross-examined in court, hearsay is generally inadmissible. However, there are recognized exceptions, such as a dying declaration, where a statement made by someone close to death may be deemed reliable enough to be admitted. Additionally, medical books can sometimes be used as hearsay evidence to clarify or reference standard practices in certain contexts. While hearsay is typically objectionable, these exceptions balance practicality and fairness in the judicial process. Expert testimony plays a vital role when legal disputes involve specialized knowledge beyond the experience of the average juror. An expert witness, such as a medical specialist, may offer an informed opinion on complex or technical issues, clarifying matters that laypersons might struggle to understand. By contrast, experts are unnecessary for areas within common knowledge, like recognizing that a broken bone typically needs an X-ray. In some cases, multiple experts may present different viewpoints, and it falls to the jury to evaluate these conflicting opinions, ultimately deciding which is the most credible, consistent, and compelling based on the evidence presented. When facing a lawsuit, defendants may raise various defenses to avoid or reduce liability. Ignorance of fact and unintentional wrongs, claiming no awareness of the crucial facts and that any harm was not deliberate. Assumption of risk, arguing that the plaintiff voluntarily accepted known dangers. Contributory negligence, alleging the plaintiff's own negligence contributed to the injury, potentially barring recovery. Comparative negligence, reducing damages based on the plaintiff's percentage of fault. Good Samaritan statutes, protecting individuals who provide emergency care from liability except in cases of gross negligence. Borrowed servant doctrine, shifting liability to the party who temporarily controls an employee's actions. Captain of the ship doctrine, holding the lead surgeon or physician responsible for the surgical team's actions. Statute of limitations, barring claims filed after a legally prescribed time period. Sovereign immunity, shielding government entities or employees from liability in certain circumstances. And last but not least, intervening cause, contending that an unforeseeable event or third party's action broke the chain of causation. Ignorance of fact or unintentional wrongdoing is generally not a valid defense in legal proceedings. The fundamental principle, ignorance of the law is no excuse, reflects that individuals are expected to be aware of and abide by applicable rules and regulations. If courts routinely accepted ignorance or lack of intent as a defense, nearly any defendant could evade responsibility by simply claiming they did not know or did not mean to cause harm. Consequently, this stance preserves the effectiveness of the law and ensures that parties cannot avoid accountability by professing ignorance or an absence of malicious intent. Assumption of risk is a defense that applies when a plaintiff knowingly and voluntarily engages in an activity with recognized dangers. To invoke it successfully, the defendant must show that the plaintiff both understood the specific risk involved. For example, knew the activity carried a possibility of harm, and chose to freely and voluntarily proceed despite that danger. By establishing that the plaintiff agreed to confront a known hazard, the defendant may be relieved of liability for resulting injuries, since the plaintiff effectively consented to accept the potential harm. Contributory negligence happens when the plaintiff's own carelessness plays a role in causing their injury. In places that strictly follow contributory negligence rules, if the defendant can show the plaintiff was not reasonably careful, the plaintiff might end up getting no damages at all. On the other hand, comparative negligence looks at how much each side is at fault. A court or jury figures out what percentage of the blame lies with the plaintiff and what percentage with the defendant. Any damages that are awarded are then adjusted based on those percentages. So a plaintiff who is partly at fault can still recover something, just not the full amount. Good Samaritan statutes are designed to protect healthcare professionals and sometimes laypersons from liability when they voluntarily provide emergency care outside of a clinical setting. By limiting legal risks, these laws encourage individuals with relevant skills, such as physicians or nurses, to offer aid at accident scenes or in other urgent situations without fear of being sued if something goes wrong. However, immunity under these statutes typically applies only to actions taken in a true emergency, meaning once the immediate crisis ends or care shifts to a formal healthcare environment, ordinary legal standards for negligence may again come into play. Now I want to talk about the borrowed servant doctrine. This principle applies when one employer temporarily lends an employee to another for a specific task. In healthcare, for example, imagine a nurse employed by a hospital who is loaned to a physician during surgery. While assisting, the nurse is effectively considered the physician's employee because she follows his orders and works under his control. Consequently, any liability arising from her actions falls on the borrowing employer, here the physician. This doctrine ensures clear accountability in situations where control, not the formal employer relationship, governs the working arrangement. In this slide, we will explore the captain of the ship doctrine. Historically, This doctrine positioned the surgeon as the ultimate authority in the operating room, much like a ship's captain responsible for every aspect of a voyage. However, modern operating rooms are collaborative environments. Surgeons no longer control every team member involved in patient care. Instead, liability should be assigned based on who had actual control over the patient during the procedure. This more realistic approach reflects the contemporary operating room's team-based dynamics and ensures that responsibility is fairly allocated according to the actual relationships and authority present at the time of care. Let's define and introduce the statute of limitations. This term refers to legislatively imposed time constraints that restrict the period after an injury occurs, during which a legal action must be commenced. In other words, if a potential malpractice or personal injury claim is not filed within a specific period, the injured party may lose the right to sue. The computation of when this period begins varies by state. For example, some states start the clock from the date that the physician terminated treatment, while others begin from the time of the wrongful act. Additionally, certain jurisdictions calculate the period based on when the patient should have reasonably discovered the injury, the actual discovery date, or even the date when the contractual relationship between the patient and the physician ended. Understanding these differences is crucial for both healthcare providers and legal professionals to ensure that claims are filed within the appropriate time frame. Let's now define and introduce the concept of sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity is a legal doctrine that historically provides federal and state governments with protection from lawsuits, meaning that individuals could not sue the government for the tortious actions of its employees without its consent. This principle was rooted in the idea that the government, as a sovereign entity, was immune from being held liable in its own courts. However, over time, both federal and state governments have largely abolished or significantly limited this immunity. Modern legal frameworks now allow individuals to seek redress against government actions in many cases, reflecting a shift toward greater accountability while still recognizing the need to protect essential governmental functions. Understanding this evolution is key to comprehending how liability and accountability are balanced in cases involving government conduct. Intervening cause arises when a third party's independent act becomes the proximate cause of an injury, interrupting the direct link between the defendant's original negligence and the harm suffered. Essentially, if a third party's negligent act is both extraordinary under the circumstances and unforeseeable as a normal and probable consequence of the defendant's conduct, it can supersede the defendant's liability. In such cases, the third party's actions are seen as the true cause of the injury, thereby relieving the original defendant of legal responsibility. This doctrine is crucial in determining liability, ensuring that defendants are not held accountable for unforeseeable actions beyond their control. As we approach the conclusion of a trial, the process shifts to its final phases. In the upcoming slides, we'll explore these crucial stages in detail. First, we have the closing statements, where each party summarizes the evidence and arguments presented during the trial. Next, the judge's charge is delivered, outlining the legal standards and guiding the jury on their responsibilities. Following this, the jury deliberation phase occurs as jurors review the case details to reach a verdict. Finally, if liability is established, the process moves to awarding damages, where compensation for the injured party is determined. So closing statements mark one of the final critical phases of a trial. They give attorneys the opportunity to summarize for the jury and the court the key evidence and arguments presented during the trial. In these statements, each side reinforces the narrative they built, highlighting the facts and legal points that support their position. At this stage, the court may also consider a motion for a directed verdict. Such a motion is granted if either 1. There is no genuine question of fact for the jury to decide, meaning the evidence overwhelmingly supports one side, or 2. The evidence fails to establish a legal basis for a verdict favoring the plaintiff. This mechanism ensures that only cases with sufficient evidence and a solid legal foundation proceed to a jury verdict. So closing statements mark one of the final critical phases of a trial. They give attorneys the opportunity to summarize for the jury and the court the key evidence and arguments presented during the trial. In these statements, each side reinforces the narrative they built, highlighting the facts and legal points that support their position. At this stage, the court may also consider a motion for a directed verdict. Such a motion is granted if either 1. There is no genuine question of fact for the jury to decide, meaning the evidence overwhelmingly supports one side, or 2. The evidence fails to establish a legal basis for a verdict favoring the plaintiff. This mechanism ensures that only cases with sufficient evidence and a solid legal foundation proceed to a jury verdict. After the attorney's summations, the judge delivers the charge to the jury before they recess for deliberation. This judge's charge is critical as it outlines the jury's responsibilities and explains the legal principles that apply to the case. The charge informs the jury about the alternatives available to them when deciding the verdict. Importantly, the instructions must be presented impartially and must not prejudice the jury. If the court's jury instructions are flawed or biased, it may constitute an error significant enough to affect the outcome, potentially serving as grounds for appeal. This step ensures that the jury fully understands their role and the law they must apply during deliberations. After the judge's charge, the jury retires to the deliberation room to discuss the case in detail. In this phase, the jurors carefully review all the evidence, the judge's instructions, and the arguments presented by both parties. The goal is to determine the defendant's liability based on a fair and thorough assessment of the facts and applicable law. Once the jury reaches a verdict, whether through consensus or a majority decision, they reconvene in the courtroom to present their determination to the judge. This stage is pivotal as it represents the culmination of the jury's collective reasoning and decision-making process. In legal cases, damages provide monetary compensation for harm suffered and serve to deter wrongful behavior. There are several distinct types. Nominal damages recognize that a wrong has been committed, though the compensation is minimal and largely symbolic. Compensatory damages aim to reimburse the plaintiff for the actual injury or detriment incurred, covering both tangible and intangible losses. Hedonic damages address the loss of enjoyment of life, compensating for non-economic impacts of the injury. Lastly, punitive damages are awarded when an injury results from gross carelessness or a blatant disregard for others' safety, serving as both punishment for the defendant and a deterrent to future misconduct. The plaintiff's schedule of damages delineates various compensatory categories reflecting the diverse impacts of an injury. Future pain and suffering address anticipated long-term physical discomfort and limitations, while emotional distress compensates for the psychological trauma endured. In instances of particularly egregious conduct, punitive damages may be awarded to both punish the defendant and deter similar future behavior. Additionally, damages may be categorized based on their magnitude, ranging from damages not excessive, where compensation aligns closely with the injury's impact, to damages excessive, which may appear disproportionate. In some cases, statutory limits apply and awards may be capped to ensure fairness and proportionality. So, in the case of civil trials involving multiple defendants, determining liability is a critical procedural matter. Courts assess whether to apply joint, several, or joint and several liability doctrines. Under joint liability, each defendant is held independently responsible for their wrongful acts, with their contributions evaluated separately. Under several liability, each defendant's financial responsibility is limited strictly to the percentage of fault attributed to them. However, with joint and several liability, any one defendant can be required to pay the entire amount of damages awarded to the plaintiff if other defendants cannot pay their share. This framework not only impacts trial strategy, but also influences post-judgment recovery as defendants seek contribution from one another. In civil trials, grounds for appeals serve as essential safeguards, ensuring that trial errors do not compromise justice. One common ground is that the verdict is excessive, arguing that the damages awarded far exceed what the evidence supports. Another ground arises when the trial court improperly excluded evidence that should have been admitted. Such evidence, if considered, might have significantly influenced the jury's decision. Conversely, an appeal may contend that inadmissible evidence was improperly allowed, potentially skewing the outcome in favor of one party. These errors in evidentiary rulings or jury determinations invite a higher court to review and correct the record, ensuring fairness throughout the litigation process. Once the judgment is finalized and all appeals have been exhausted, the process of executing the judgment commences. At this stage, the defendant is legally obligated to comply with the court's decision, which typically involves paying the determined amount of damages to the plaintiff. Execution of judgments ensures that the verdict is not merely theoretical, but is enforced through legal mechanisms. These may include asset seizures, wage garnishments, or other collection procedures, ensuring that the plaintiff receives the awarded compensation. This phase underscores the finality of the judicial process, where the defendant's responsibility to remedy the harm is both binding and enforceable under the law. In our chapter review section, we'll start by exploring the concept of pleadings, which are the written statements of facts and law filed by parties in a lawsuit. These include documents like the complaint, demurrer, answer, and bill of particulars. The complaint in particular is crucial as it initiates the case by identifying the parties involved, the cause of action, and the damages sought. We'll also look at pretrial motions such as preliminary objections, demurrers, and counterclaims, which can shape the case even before it goes to trial. Finally, we'll discuss the decision basis. When only legal issues are in question, the judge rules based solely on the pleadings, but any factual disputes require a full trial. Let's dive into these fundamental elements together. In this slide, we'll start with the discovery process, which is essentially the pretrial investigation, where both sides gather facts. This process often includes witness examinations. In many cases, such as healthcare-related disputes, hospital incident and investigation reports are generally discoverable. However, it's important to note that communications between a client and their attorney remain protected under attorney-client privilege. Next, we'll discuss motions. A motion to dismiss is typically filed when the complaint fails to establish a legally recognized claim. Alternatively, when there are no factual disputes and only legal questions remain, a party may request a motion for summary judgment, asking the court to decide the case without a trial. Finally, we'll consider jurisdiction, ensuring that the case is heard in the appropriate court that has authority over the subject matter. Let's dive into these topics to see how they set the stage for a fair and efficient legal process. Let's now explore key components of the courtroom process. The judge presides over the trial, making decisions on legal questions, while the jury reviews the facts presented and renders an impartial verdict. A subpoena serves as a legal order compelling individuals to appear in court. Moving to legal doctrines, res ipsa loquitur, shift the burden of proof to the defendant when the injury speaks for itself. And judicial notice allows the court to accept well-known facts without requiring formal evidence. When it comes to evidence, we encounter several types: direct, demonstrative, documentary, and hearsay. Additionally, expert witnesses are often called upon to provide technical testimony that aids in clarifying complex issues. Let's now wrap up our review by discussing the defenses offered by defendants. They can argue defenses such as ignorance of fact, unintentional wrongs, or assumption of risk. In addition, negligence defenses, like contributory and comparative negligence, might reduce their liability. Defendants might also invoke statutory or doctrinal defenses, such as Good Samaritan statutes, the borrowed servant doctrine, the captain of the ship doctrine, the statute of limitations, sovereign immunity, and intervening cause, to further limit their responsibility. On the damages side, which are usually determined by the jury, awards can take the form of nominal, compensatory, hedonic, or punitive damages. This concludes our chapter review, summarizing key defenses and damage considerations in civil litigation.